I'd like to welcome you all to Unctad Summer School 2019. My name is Gül Ünal, and I'm the Chief of Training and Outreach Unit in the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies at Unctad. Without further ado, I'll give the floor to our Director, Richard Kozelwright, for a formal introduction to the school and its team.
Thank you, Gül, and good morning to everybody. Welcome to sunny Geneva. I was meant to do something later in the week. Unfortunately, I've got to go to Japan tomorrow, so I'm going to abuse my position a little bit and combine what I was going to say later on the Global Green New Deal with some introductory remarks this morning. This is the second of the Unctad INET summer schools. The first one we had this time last year, which was more on debt and development finance as the main theme. Unctad's mandate, and we will talk about this in the next session with my colleague Cameron Kasari. Unctad has a very big mandate. I mean, the title of the institute, the name of the institution is slightly misleading. Trade and development gives the impression that somehow Unctad is exclusively a trade organization. It never was. From the beginning, as we will talk about, we had a very broad mandate. And within Unctad, the division that I head, the Globalization division, has a very broad mandate. So we do have a focus on macro and financial issues. We have a branch that works on financing for development. But we also have work on the Palestinian economy. We have work on South-South cooperation. We have work on statistics. So and of course, the focus of the work and a lot of the ideas that you will hear from my colleagues come out of the Trade and Development Report, which is the flagship publication that is produced annually by the division. So we will fill out some of those details in the next session in terms of where Unctad is coming from, where it's been, and where it might be going a little bit later. Let me then just say something about why we're picking on this topic of a global Green New Deal. It's a kind of shift from last year's summer school, but it in many respects continues some of the work that we've been doing. But let me begin with a different story. In 2007, I was not in Unctad. I was working in UN DESA in New York. I got to run what was then their flagship publication, which was called the World Economic and Social Survey, which I believe has been discontinued, which is kind of shocking. This was a report that Michael Koletsky began working on in the United Nations in the late 1940s, but is no longer a UN product as far as I can tell, which is sad. But I went there in 2007. We had to do a report on economic insecurity, which was a growing theme. Some of the kind of gloss about globalization was beginning to wear thin, and people were thinking about the problems of globalization a bit more seriously than they had in the past. And so economic insecurity was a theme. We did a report on that. I ended that report with the idea, when I got there, the big solution that was being canvassed at the time was microfinance, which for you people that I'm sure have followed those issues is as much a problem as it is a solution to a problem. So as an alternative, we put forward the need to revisit some of the ideas about economic insecurity and how to address them from the old New Deal of the Roosevelt administration, and an ideology that had shaped the post-war global agenda, which was an era of particularly strong growth and, relatively at least, economic security, economic and social security. So we finished that report in 2008. It came out. It was the 2008 report, and of course, 2 months later, the world essentially blew up in a major financial crisis. And so we needed to talk about that. But it also coincided with the beginnings of the discussions in mid-2008 for the Copenhagen COP, which some of you, probably not, some of you may remember, was being billed as the way in which the international community would come together to solve the climate problem, which was becoming increasingly apparent as an international challenge. And from our perspective, of course, in the UN, and which is what we're going to talk about a lot in the coming week, you can't solve the climate challenge separately from the development challenge. I mean, these are inseparable challenges. So we started to write a report. We wrote a report on how you potentially solve that problem of addressing potential environmental breakdown in a world where the vast majority of people want to see a major improvement in their living standards and economic opportunities. And we finished that report, and obviously it coincided with the financial crisis. We saw the need for an expansionary response to the economic crisis, the financial meltdown, and we saw that as a potential through a strong investment agenda of shifting the growth path from a high carbon to a low carbon growth trajectory. And so we finished the report. I mean, I'm not, I have to be honest with you, a climate expert. I'm not an environmental economist, but I think it's we thought it was a pretty good report. We went to see, and it coincided with the Copenhagen COP, which we thought was an opportunity to start pushing the ideas of an ambitious economic, social, political agenda around the decarbonization of growth based on a big investment push, based on the need for serious public sector involvement in solving these kinds of problems, both climatic and developmental. And so we went to see Ban Ki-moon. I know you won't remember, but Ban Ki-moon's slogan for COP was "Seal the deal." So we had come up with the idea that not only do we need a Green New Deal to address the problems of climate and development, we need a global Green New Deal. So we went to see Ban Ki-moon to pitch our arguments to him in the run-up to the Copenhagen COP, and he was completely uninterested, essentially. His main concern at that time was to have a song for the conference. I remember that distinctly. He wanted a song for the conference. So he wasn't very interested in the kinds of economic ideas that we were, and fairly radical economic ideas that we were pushing as a necessary response to this combined economic and environmental crisis. So the idea of a global Green New Deal died a death, essentially. The Copenhagen COP, as some of you I'm sure were probably there, it fell apart. And it fell apart because developing countries were not convinced that the advanced economies who had created the problem of a climate crisis were willing to make the necessary commitments in terms of technology transfer, in terms of finance, in terms of adaptation, etc., that was required of them to help developing countries deal with the problem of climatic shocks and also to shift to a very different type of growth path. So the Copenhagen COP fell apart. Since then, there has been some re-engagement with the Paris Agreement, obviously. But what's kind of interesting for us is that the idea of a Green New Deal has been recovered to some extent through domestic initiatives, and in particular, as I'm sure you all know, by the efforts of young Democratic Congress women, in particular, in the United States, to try and combine a climate agenda with the particular problems of insecurity and economic malaise in the United States. So the Green New Deal idea has essentially resurfaced around challenges initially in the United States, but I think has now become part of a broader narrative. We see it in the United Kingdom, where there are similar initiatives. We're hearing it from Brussels now. So it's become a kind of theme. I mean, a new theme for thinking about these challenges. And so we think this is, and in a sense, I guess, we were ahead of the game, in a way. And we are now trying to revisit that agenda in light of what has happened over the last decade in terms of the direction and challenges that have emerged in the global economy in this post-crisis, post-financial crisis era. So that's why we've picked on this topic. The Trade and Development Report of 2017 had already raised the idea of a global New Deal to respond to the failure of most economic policymakers to come to terms with the post-financial crisis challenges, in our opinion: slow growth, rising inequality, growing insecurity, etc. So we in our 27 report, and to some extent our 2018 report, we've pitched the idea of the need for a global New Deal to reframe the multilateral agenda. And multilateralism, as Gul said, is in very serious crisis right now. And there is no consensus narrative beyond business as usual. So can I shift this? Let me just say something very quickly about that, because I don't want to cut into Jenny's presentation. But that's the broad context in which we as a division are approaching this. Now, behind that idea of the challenge, of course, is a 40th anniversary that I'm sure, looking at you, none of you remember. And that's the 40th anniversary, if you like, of the rise of neoliberalism. 40 years ago, if you were around then, I'm sorry to say I was, Mrs. Thatcher had just taken power in the United Kingdom. Ronald Reagan was about to take power to take the reins of government in the United States. That's 1979. So we've had 40 years of what we would see as a neoliberal agenda being the dominant paradigm for thinking about economic, social, and political challenges. And it began very crudely. Greed is good. Government is not the solution to the problem. Government is the problem. That was Ronald Reagan's famous slogan. There is no alternative, Mrs. Thatcher. There's no such thing as society, Mrs. Thatcher. So a very, very strident and aggressive agenda to begin with. It's kind of softened over the years, right? It's softened into notions of we don't want to leave anyone behind. The world is doing really well, but we don't want to leave anyone behind. I'm sure you've heard all about that. Need for public-private partnerships, inclusive finance, doing well by doing good. You know, the Clinton Foundation, Bill Gates. Corporate social responsibility, all these ideas have now kind of softened the harder edges of the original neoliberalism, but they're part of this basic neoliberal agenda. And it's not an agenda, although it's often associated with an agenda of state versus market. A lot of people think of neoliberalism as being state versus market, and there's something to that, but it's too crude. I think the neoliberal agenda fundamentally, and if you read the recent book by Quinn Slobodian called The Globalists, which is a great book and everyone should read it actually, on the historical origins of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is essentially an agenda about making the world safe for mobile capital. That's what neoliberalism is fundamentally about. And it doesn't fit neatly into a state versus market dichotomy. So we're all globalists now. Okay, that's what the neoliberal agenda is about. We're all globalists now. The world needs to be made safe for mobile capital. And so it's a bad cop, good cop. There's a kind of good cop, bad cop. The bad cop is the hard neoliberals. The good cops are the kind of social inclusion. Don't leave anybody behind. And but they all share this common view about the need for mobile capital in a globally safe world. And here's a couple of quotes that I think typify. I'm not sure you'll get them. Some of you might get them. This is a kind of Batman and Robin combination of neoliberalism we have here. The first one is, thanks to globalization, policy decisions in the US have been largely replaced by global market forces. It hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. Any ideas who that is? That is one-time disciple of neoliberal scribbler Ayn Rand and former chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. Is that first quote when he was asked who he was going to vote for in the election between Obama and John McCain. He said it doesn't matter. Economic policy is irrelevant. Global market forces determine everything. The second one, I hear people say we have to stop and debate globalization. You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer. In the era of rapid globalization, there is no mystery about what works. An open liberal economy prepared constantly to change, to remain competitive. The new world rewards those who are open to it. Foreign investment improves the economy. You probably won't get that. That's close to home for me. That's former rock and roll impresario, one-time Trotskyist and general scumbag Anthony Leighton Blair, known to his friends as Tony. That's who that is, Tony Blair. And these are typical quotes about the nature of globalization. And we've spent a lot of time in Unctad trying to criticize that. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through that. We'll talk about that with Cameron later. But it's very important to recall a number of things. First of all, the neoliberal revolution it's clearly been about ideas and ideology and translating ideology into policies, and policies that you're very familiar with: liberalization, deregulation, privatization, austerity as the default macroeconomic policy, etc. And that's an important part of the neoliberal agenda. But the neoliberal agenda is not just about translating ideas in. It's about political economy. It's about power. It's about trade-offs. It's about conflicting interests and setting priorities around those conflicts. And who sets those priorities? It's a political economy challenge. And to understand the political economy challenge, you need to understand some of the major shifts in the world economy around which interests have been shaped and principles set and values established. And in the work that we've done, in addition to identifying what we would see as a hyper-globalized world with the neoliberal ideological revolution, you have to understand that the world is in modern capitalism has changed in very fundamental ways around the rise of finance. I'm sure a lot of you have done work on financialization and the nature of financialization, the role of big banks, of shadow banking, etc., highly mobile capital in the economy, and the way that has shifted economic and political dynamics in the late 20th and 21st century. And a lot of work has been done on that. I'm sure a lot of you people have done work on that yourselves. The second one that was initially missed in a lot of the discussion, including by progressives and critics of neoliberalism, was the re-emergence of corporate power and the dominance of very large corporations in shaping economic prospects, global supply chains, etc. And the rise of rent-seeking behavior, etc., that follows from that. We will have discussions on all these issues. Nicholas Shaxson, who will give a lecture later in this week, has written a brilliant book called The Finance Curse. He will give a lecture on Thursday, I think, on that problem of financialization. Anastasia Nesteleova will give a talk. She's got a new book coming out called Sabotage, on the kinds of practices of large financial institutions and shadow banking and the way that has distorted economic prospects. My colleague Stephanie Blankenberg will talk about the nature of rent-seeking behavior. So these will be issues that you will come back to and you'll have to discuss. The point that we want to make is, I think, when we talk about these interlocking influences, and they are interlocking influences, is that these have had a profound impact, not just on policy making in the late 20th, early 21st century, but on the rules of the game of contemporary capitalism. And if we're going to address the kinds of problems that we see that coming out of this hyperglobalization, you can't tinker with the current rules of the game. You have to think very hard about how you change those rules of the game, because as the way we see it, those rules of the game as they are currently constituted have not been good for most people and have certainly not been good for the planet. And so what we hope the Global Green New Deal provides as an alternative is not just a critique of contemporary global economic dynamics, which Unctad has been doing for years, but as an alternative framework for thinking about different policy agendas, different normative systems, different political relationships at the national, the regional, and the global level. And to some extent, it's about rehabilitating the state. Here's a famous quote from John Maynard Keynes in his letter to Roosevelt in the late 1930s, when he saw the need to restore faith in the wisdom and power of government. But it's a lot more than that. We need somehow to change the rules if we're going to get more inclusive and sustainable outcomes. And that's what we will talk about, I think, in many of the presentations that we're going to have in the morning sessions of this summer school. Let me just finish here. I mean, hopefully life begins at 40, right? That's a famous phrase. If we're going to improve the lives of most people and deal with the environmental breakdown, we're going to have to break with neoliberalism. There's going to have to be a break with that paradigm, because you cannot solve these problems with that under that intellectual rubric. Indeed, you're going to see those problems worsen, that's for sure. So one hopes that life begins at 40, and even though most of you are not there yet, that will be your responsibility to ensure that life, in fact, does begin at 40. But there are a couple of other anniversaries that will resonate in the discussions that we have over the coming few days. One, of course, this is the 75th anniversary of the founding of Bretton Woods. So multilateralism essentially began 75 years ago. Now, actually, if you want a great book about what happened in Bretton Woods, there's a book called The Summit by Ed Conway, which is a blow-by-blow account of what happened in the 6 weeks, in the months preceding, but in the 6 weeks around that conference in Bretton Woods in 1944, and the nature of multilateralism that was created then, the way that evolved in the subsequent 30 years, the way that system broke up in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and gave rise to hyperglobalization is going to be a theme that resonates, I think, through the discussions we have. And of course, it's 10 years since the London G20 conference, the conference that came after the financial crisis. Gordon Brown helped to save the world back in 2009. You might remember that, actually, some of you might remember that. Promising a new Bretton Woods, Nicolas Sarkozy promised to create a new world order, and it hasn't happened. And the big question for you and for us as participants in that system is, despite the shock of the global financial crisis, and it was the biggest crisis since 1929-33, why haven't we really fundamentally changed the multilateral system to address the kinds of problems that were revealed by the financial crisis and have been turbocharged by a recognition that we are now facing an existential environmental crisis? So we have these anniversaries that are going to shape the discussions that we have all week, and that's part of our bread and butter work that we do here in Geneva, and I'm sure it's many of the issues that you are thinking about as young scholars are also linked to these kinds of questions. So I've got 5 minutes. Let me just I think I've more or less said what I want to say, I think, by way of an introduction. We will have a combination, as you know, of colleagues of mine who are working on these issues in Unctad, particularly around the work that we do in the Trade and Development Report, and we are bringing in what we think are complementary experts from outside of Unctad who will address related issues that they have themselves been working on and researching. And one of those scholars that we are very pleased to invite to Unctad this morning is Gianni Vaggi. Gianni has been working on these issues for longer than I have, even, I think, Gianni. He's been teaching at the University of Pavia in Italy for a long time around issues of economic development, particularly the way in which the classical political economy ideas have shaped our thinking about economic development issues and challenges. Many books, many articles around those topics that I don't think I need to outline this morning. It would take me too long anyway. But it's a great pleasure and Gianni's just produced a kind of a book that kind of encapsulates your 40 or 50 years of thinking about these problems in a very nice, short, succinct, 110-page volume on the intellectual ideas that have shaped our thinking about economic development, culminating in the challenges that the UN has posed around the Sustainable Development Goals, and whether we really do have an intellectual foundation for those goals, or whether it's just a nice list of goals, targets and indicators that everyone can sign up to, but around which there's not a rigorous analytical underpinnings. Gianni argues there is, and I think it's a book that all of you would benefit from reading. So, Gianni, I will give you the floor for 45 minutes. I think we'll open it up for questions after that. All right, thank you.
Can you hear me? Is that right? Okay. Thank you very much, Richard and Gul, for inviting me here. As Richard has made clear, I belong to this community, but from the point of view of an old academic person, because, clearly I've been more or less in the business for a long time, teaching about development economics, about economic analysis, and I started University of Pavia as an undergraduate, but then as a graduate student in Cambridge in 1971, which is really, really long ago. But I've also been working in the field of cooperation. I mean, practical cooperation, knowledge cooperation, university cooperation. We have a program in Pavia, which is a master program, which, as you can see, has generated different initiatives around the world. So I must say, I have had the opportunity to benefit, from experiences like talking and discussing with classes of students that may be a bit younger than you or the same age, a bit all around the world. And this, it's more or less what I would like to discuss with you. A brief introduction on sustainable development, what is meant today. And then a bit of a longer part two, on the, long-run visions on value and development, okay? So going back a bit to the classical political economists and try to understand in which way they can help us in this recovering this relationship between people, prosperity, and planet. That also includes some more recent contribution, let's say, from the 40s and the 50s. I hope to be. Then the third part is on what I call financial mercantilism. I will be very, very fast on that because, as Richard said, you will have occasions to discuss about the role of finance, which people were been working a lot on this, like Stephanie, of course, and finally on sustainable reproduction. The aim of the story basically is to try to come to the fourth point, trying to see what can be done, what should be done, which are the real challenges that we are facing here today. This is the little book that kindly Richard was mentioning. It is very, very small, and just one thing, multilateralism, of course, hints to power. That's clear. We have to be able to recollect, to join the issue of power, the issue of value, which for us as economists is of course an important element, and the issue of sustainable, what I call sustainable reproduction. You can call it the Green New Deal, and deal means some sort of power sharing. So where is the power? How is the power? How is power related to economics? And what is the challenge that Richard was hinting for you young people ahead of you? Okay, let's try. We'll see. Everyone knows. This is well known, no problems, okay? If I ask someone what the hell is development, sustainable development, more or less they refer to these 2015 SDGs, okay? Obviously, there are some problems with some of these SDGs because there are conflicting and trade-offs among them. For instance, keep this in mind, zero hunger. If you go to the targets, improving agricultural productivity, that's particularly for developing countries, of course, is a major target within the goal, okay? And we have to remember that. He was mentioning Richard COP. Of course, in the same year, we also had in December COP21, Paris, the climate change. So let's say that between September and December 2015, we have a combination of conferences which in many ways they should tell us what is the aim, which are the goals for the future to come. 17 goals, 169 targets, 232 indicators, but indicators are being added. There is a problem of measuring, which is complicated, so, but it's a bit of a lot. Remember that before that there were 8 Millennium Development Goals in the year 2000. Then 17, the whole process was a bit of a mess. So I try to put together the different goals, okay, into, and this is part of what you find in the UN resolution of 2015, into 5 areas: people, human development, planet, environmental sustainability, prosperity, economic sustainability, and the 2 final goals, which are obviously extremely challenging, and they do relate, both of them, to the issue of power and power sharing or not sharing, of course. Partnership is clear, peace and justice, come on. Please keep in mind people and planet, because they will come back in our presentation, in our discussion. A lot of SDGs, obviously, and the targets are what in the jargon of classical political economy would have called use values, well-identified elements, and not just generic prices or value, but something which is clear, is something I would like to have. It could have been basic necessities or corn or employment or something like that. But of course, now this has to be achieved in the world of exchange values as well. Exchange values are values as we define them. Use values are concrete element of what we consider to be valuable worth for our well-being. Why the long-term, long-run views? Well, I was trained in the very beginning of my academic career back in Cambridge. I did a lot of work on history of economic ideas, and in particular on classical political economy. Why political economy? Because you can hear about political economy even today, you know, people who are trying to understand how we vote and which are the interests and how this matches. So it's a kind of game related to the polls. But political economy was political because they were facing the issue of power. They were facing issues which were relevant, the crucial elements for their own society. We'll come to Adam Smith, you will see that easily. So political economy means you have to do with something which doesn't come from the last paper published in the American Economic Review or something like that, or in the Journal of Economic Theory, but it has to do from the issue that our society, that your country is now facing. And in that analysis, you don't remove the power, historical, social element. You keep that. And you don't believe, sorry to say that, you don't act just as an economist per se. History and economic history, Richard, is so much important in trying to understand. So that's political, that's the political element in it. All right, a very quick view on what we can get from these people in terms of what the hell is power, value, and sustainable reproduction. While going back to these founding fathers, so to speak, well, this comes from the first Human Development Report, okay? And there is a mention of some of the guys that we will mention here. Of course, they are in red, plus others. They also mention Immanuel Kant, obviously. You cannot talk about human development, and I would say even sustainable development, if you don't have, in one way or the other, the perspective of how these move the long term, the vision, where you come from and where you want to go. Much more recently, Mariana Mazzucato, a very nice book, The Value of Everything. The first 3 chapters are dedicated more or less to the people we will briefly discuss these days. Many things we have heard and we will learn about creation and extraction of value. Those who create, those who take. In the old days, it was productive and unproductive labor. Now we have many jargon, slang like rentier capitalism, patrimonial capitalism, rent-seeking, everything, okay? But we need something more to separate the ground field, the playing field, into the good ones and the bad ones. We need some sort of, how to say, founding views and notion which can help us to go through. Let me start not with classical political economy, but what has been for almost 3 centuries the dominating theory in Western Europe, from the late 16th century to Adam Smith to the 18th century. And this was the age of merchant capital. This is the East India Company, established in the 600, on the 31st of December in 600. I'm not going to try to pronounce these Dutch words. Maybe some of you can. If you go to Indonesia, you will see that VOC is still very much well known there because it has been the dominating force for. These were private joint stock companies, which at a certain point they gave over to the states, and in particular, in the case of Indonesia, it was passed on to the Dutch state when the company got broken, in more or less around this period. And the East India Company, they had several problems during the 18th century, and finally India became part of the British Raj, the British Empire, only in 1958. These were private joint. The person who represents the mercantilist thought most is for sure Thomas Moon. He was a director of the East India Company from 1615. These are his 2 most well-known books. In particular, look at the subtitle of this book, okay? he was defending the interests and the good reasons and the well-being for everyone, of course, of what the East India Company was doing, which was taking control of the trade between the Indies and the mainland. But his most important book is the second one. It is not clear when he wrote in, because the first edition is gone. No one has found it, at least up till now. And if you found it, it will be extremely valuable. England's treasure by foreign trade. This is the theory of wealth. This is the theory of national wealth. You get your national wealth, obviously, by a surplus in the balance of trade. This was the theory that he established, and this is the theory that Adam Smith in 1776 trying to supersede, to attack, and to offer a new vision. But this is, and the merchant profits were basically, and I will come back on this, buying cheap and selling dear. You buy coffee or spices in the Indies and you bring those goods, which are goods, and these are use values in a sense. You bring them to Amsterdam or to London and you sell them. So your profit, it's a profit which arises from your activities on these particular faraway markets in this case. What is good for the merchant is good for the country as a whole. Okay? Answering the objection, there was a debate, there was a fight, but of course these merchant people, these mercantilist people, these merchant companies were trying to defend the good. So economic thought was used as a way to defend their economic power position, and the characteristic of the age of merchant capital is the alliance between the state and the merchant company. Indonesia has been run by the Dutch East India Company on behalf of the Netherlands, and of course, as you all know, India has been run by East India Company on behalf of the British Empire up to 1858. So this alliance, or the use of the state for it, was a fundamental element. Something started to change long ago. This guy, William Petty, he made a fortune in Oliver Cromwell's army in Ireland. He became very rich in some ways, okay? But in a treatise he wrote in 1962, we find, among other things, this very interesting phrase. A society of 1,000 men, sorry girls, he was talking about not human beings, but men, all right, can sustain itself thanks to the work of 100 of these. Why? Because they are more productive. They produce corn for everyone, okay? So in a sense, we don't need trade to become rich. We need people, those 100, to be able to be very productive. So this is a principle that 1 century later will be picked up and by Smith, and Smith knew Petty. But for 1 century stayed there. It was ignored. It didn't come to the forefront, okay? Mercantilists carried on and continued to dominate political economy, theory and political economy. Let's move now to the 18th century. This guy is François Quesnay. He was the private doctor to Madame de Pompadour. When in Cambridge, long ago, I did a PhD on the economic ideas of physiocracy of Quesnay, of the French Enlightenment, let's say, 1748, 1780, something like that. And I remember, which was fascinating when I was working in the university library in Cambridge, to read the stories of, not only about economics, but also about history, about the political life, the society of those periods. I must confess now that I even read a book about the private life of Madame de Pompadour, because he was the doctor to Madame de Pompadour. She was the favorite of Louis XV. But this guy is the guy, and you can go to Marx, to Leontief, who invented in one way or the other input-output. The idea of reproduction is Tableau économique of 1758. and circular production flows, inputs and outputs. Inputs and outputs. This is a very simple and stupid scheme which depicts what many, many people have credited to François Quesnay. Okay, you have inputs of corn, you produce more, is the old petty idea. You have a net product, a surplus. Mind you, reproduction, what the hell is reproduction? 150 we produce, but 100 has to be put aside. It is, nowadays we could say, the replacement of capital. In those days, it was really the replacement of subsistence wages and, of course, raw material, seeds, and so on and so forth. But also they had some, he also distinguished between circulated and fixed capital. And, of course, here the composition of output and of inputs, the structure, what you produce is not just a generic value. Otherwise, you might not be able to reproduce. You must reproduce subsistence. There is an element of specificity in the composition of inputs and outputs. It's not a generic investment of 100 money and of course, his main issue was the modernization of French agriculture. SDG number 2, eliminate hunger. In those days, France was suffering from famines in a kind of regular way, okay? So his problem was, how is it possible that we are not even able to feed our people, okay? And the way for him was to invest in the possible best available technologies, and the best available technologies was technologies which were using a lot of fixed capital. Capital accumulation in the sector which is producing wage goods for the whole economy. Adam Smith, you know, by the way, he wanted to dedicate the Wealth of Nations to François Quesnay, but François Quesnay died a couple of years before he published the book, and then it was not dedicated to him, but that's the title of book 1. No need to go to trade, no need to have a surplus in foreign trade. The national wealth depends on the productive powers of labor and on the way in which it is distribution among the different group of people. This is the structure of Book 1 of the Wealth of Nations. Division of labor, production, output, physical goods. But then the problem is value, of course. And then the problem is distribution. Physical production is the starting point, but then we know that it works out through a price system, through a value system, and then the problem is with distribution, wages, profits, and rent. The different ranks of people is a functional distribution, of course. It's not just Of course, this is also quite easy. The real wealth is the goods you produce, but then Book 2 of the Wealth of Nations is about accumulation of capital and the different employments of capital. The natural order of investments for Smith is first, you go to agriculture. Why? Wage goods. You have to help your people to survive. That's the first thing. Second, manufacturing, diversify. Third, domestic trade. Why? Because you need to spread all these goods. Last, foreign trade. Of course, for the mercantilists, foreign trade were first, and then everything was following. No, this is okay. By the way, something that we tend to forget sometimes is that for Adam Smith, it was not so much the growth rate of the economy which was the decisive magnitude. It was the profit rate. The economy was progressing if the profit rate was high. So he was clear in his description of capitalism. And this is something that we have a bit forgotten, in fact. Then, of course, labor productivity depends on the amount of capital that you invest. In 60s and 70s in Cambridge, we call that embodied technical progress. It's not something coming from heaven, exogenous. It's really part of the investments that you make. Power. The invisible hand market which takes care of everything and things like that. Well, these are just a couple of quotations from Adam Smith, from The Wealth of Nations. There could be others, obviously, but that tells us that there are not coinciding interests in the economy, in the nation state. There are opposition of interest. And the the merchants and the master manufacturers are in a more powerful position. They can decide more. The workmen, or the famous expression, the laboring poor. Sustainable Development Goal number 8, full employment and decent work. Okay? These were two issues which in the early 70s had been picked up also from ILO, not far away from here, and by people like Richard Jolly, for instance, okay? But then they stayed there. And this is what he writes, talking about big corporation. Remember the mercantilism, the alliance between the state, or the use they were making of the state. But this alliance could perpetuate or even increase the difference. So we have increasing imbalances. This we skip because it's getting too late. Sorry. David Ricardo, the corn laws, profits versus rent. There is no economic growth benefits everyone in the same way. He was clear about that. The debate on the corn laws, which was about introducing a tariff, a duty on the import of corn in England at the end of Napoleonic War. The Importation Act introduced tariff. It was repealed much later. And, of course, you know that Ricardo has this idea that there is a trade-off between real wages and the profit rate, something that, again, we have forgotten. So it more or less works this way, okay? There's a subsistence wage. The more you move to less fertile land, the more the profit rate decreases, okay? Because it's kind of scarcity, natural scarcity. Comparative advantage. Everyone knows Ricardo because of the comparative advantage story. But comparative advantage was a way to try to delay this process. That was it. And the same was technical progress in the production of wage goods, okay? It was not just a generic, let's go for comparative advantage. So you go on, using your timber. You are Indonesia, you sell your timber to Japan, and you import from Japan your cars. But this was not a consumer surplus or anything like that. It was just a way to try to delay this decrease. What I call a reproduction cycle, grow-oriented, means that the surplus you have to invest if you want to grow. But remember people and planet. People and planet, we found, they are the first two of the 5 areas of importance in the SDGs. People and planet are people and planet. This is a very stupid and simple representation of the fact that people and planet, they can become land, labor, capital, but they are not the same thing. We all start as people and planet. Then maybe, because of the social system of reproduction, so we become. Okay. Let us skip this. This is again a quote from Ricardo, David Ricardo, the comparative advantage story, the fact that, scarcity of land. This is what he says about the privatization of water. Not because of scarcity, but because of the monopoly price. The power element is there. Political economists, because they do not close the eyes in front of what it's clear. So you might have a price for water, okay? But that doesn't have to do necessarily with the scarcity, but by the way in which water is produced. And Va bene, this guy you know, so I will go fast now because I'm running out of time, and quite rightly Gul is telling me. A capitalistic reproduction cycle is not just an input-output, because we have an element which is generic value in general, okay, which is the M1 story, which intervenes in what we can describe the input-output story of the classical people. And people and planet are always here, but this time, in order to become laborers and natural resources and raw materials, there is this phase before. Someone has to hire them, someone has to buy them, someone has to decide where, in which sector, to do what, to hire them, okay? And of course, these someones, they work in view of. All this classical political economy story finished with the marginalist revolution, which doesn't mean these people were necessarily conservative or something like that. For instance, Léon Varrin, he was teaching in Lausanne, not far away from here. He was in favor of inheritance tax, okay? Kind of leveling the play field. But then, once you had leveled the rules of the games were obviously the rules of the game. Some recent contribution about the importance of the structure of the output, of what we produce, not a generic value. Of course, Vassili Leonti, if you remember, you know this. Piero Sraffa, some of you might remember. Other people might not be that familiar, okay? He was an Italian economist in Cambridge for many years. Sraffa's book of 1960 gave rise to this type of trade-off, and he was showing that if in an input-output system of this sort, this is linear algebra notation, in a system in which you have inputs and outputs, okay, and this is the labor vector, okay, in this type of system, you have an inverse relation between wages and profits, which was Ricardo's view, it was Marx's view. You have that in very general conditions. This is what he showed in 1960. There was a debate going on in the Quarterly Journal of Economics of 66. We are approaching the 70s, which have already been mentioned by Richard. Let me see if I have it in a better way. No, it's here. This is what Paul Samuelson writes at the end of this debate. And just read the words in red. A simple tale told by the founding fathers of marginalist thinking. The interest rate, profit rate, falls. Technology must become more mechanized, more productive. You must have a relationship like this. It's what we call a downward sloping input demand curve for the capital, and the same for labor. So if the profit rate increases because of scarcity of capital, if the profit rate decreases, is because abundance of capital. All this doesn't work. Doesn't work. It has been proved 50 years back. If this is not valid, you have no Euler theorems. Euler theorems tells that, you get what is your marginal productivity, basically. And you get a share because the input that you own is rare, is scarce. And if this doesn't work, there is no stability in Solow 1956 Grow model. The equilibrium is not any longer stable. So you don't have convergence in income per capita. Capital maybe doesn't really flow where it's more needed, which is in developing countries. But this story, even though authoritatively, the thing, signed by Samuelson, has been forgotten. And here we are in the 70s. He mentioned 79, Reagan economics and Mrs. Thatcher. Robert Lucas, you all know, of course, the micro foundation of microeconomy, rational expectation. People know. There is no need of society precisely because people, they can handle themselves, okay? They know what is good for them. They know how the economy works also. They can have a guess on them. And the state is a problem. Productive, unproductive, Bacon and Eltis, less well known but fundamental book, give really this definition. What is productive of value? The markets gives you the price. What has a positive price is a value. Forget about the concrete goods that you produce or you don't produce. The state is unproductive, okay? And so it's a there are alternatives, of course, on the issue of what do we really want to produce. I've seen from your presentation that some of you is working on structural change or something like that. Okay, this goes back to Leontiev, Zraffa, Luigi Pasinetti, still alive. And of course, the other major issue, you know, when I was in Cambridge in the 70s, we had two problems. One problem was income distribution. The second problem is who is going to decide about investments. And that really you have to go to Keynes and Kaletsky. And these are still the problems, I think, that we have today. Financial mercantilism, very, very fast. And I promise. Many people will tell you in the coming week about this story. But this, which comes from The Economist, courtesy of the, okay, I think it's an amazing description of how the world has changed. Now, Richard, look. You know, in 73, there was the oil crisis. Bretton Woods, the dollar exchange standard was no longer there because, you know, the gold window was closed on the 15th of August, 71. And then you remember 76, okay, our 76, and then 79. Hello, okay, you see, even 30 years back, things were starting to change. Now, of course, the overall amount of finance is in the range of 9 times the world GDP if you take the values. Values, market values, exchange values, not goods, okay? This is what I call financial mercantilism, okay? M1. And the financial reproduction cycle. What you have inside, think you are someone, BlackRock, okay, and you are an hedge fund. Do you really care what is being produced? Where do you invest? The important thing is to get surplus value through the market, okay? Otherwise, you go bankrupt, or we all will put our money, if we have, to some alternative fund, okay? Mind you, this is financial mercantilism. I don't mean we are not in the capitalist system. We are in capitalism. If you go back to Lenin, Hilferding, of course, financial capital is a story which... But the problem is the mechanism, buying cheap and selling dear. It was done with spices, with Utah, with cotton in the, I'm not saying in the old days, not so good old days, but it's done in the same way today. But you don't have to go across the oceans for that. You just have to stay at your computer to sell and buy any type of asset, any type of financial contract, obligation, whatever you wish, and you can make money, and you can change the power and the destiny of people. So I call it financial mercantilism, not because I think it's a stage different from the capitalist, but because of the operational way in which you work, and because what you have in here is largely irrelevant at that point. The aim is M prime. Of course, I would like to remember here someone called Hyman Minsky. Maybe some of you have heard about this person. He was talking about the systemic risk that you have in finance almost 30 years ago, but now he passed away. And power in the age of financial mercantilism. Okay? Here's a story which comes from the Financial Times. Allora, pacta sunt servanda, they say the Latin people. You have to, keep to your commitments, which sounds very nice, okay? Enforcement of law, it's another component of, we have property rights and you have to defend. Okay, fine. But this is an example, of course, of the importance of a contract, of an obligation which was taken on by the Congo many, many years ago, and it's still now being used today. The power of finance, that's even more recent. Some of you, well, otherwise, if you learn about the Volcker rule and things like that, I think you can ask also Stephanie. She knows much more than I do. You know the financial crisis. You know probably that there was a reaction which was a civil society, a political reaction. So it was if that terrible thing had the possibility to happen, what should be done? It was an attempt to rebalance something which had gone the wrong way in a kind of clear way. And the Volcker rule, which was trying to limit the activities of banks, to use their money to speculate, basically, it was going back to the old idea of the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, in which you had a separation between commercial activities and speculative investment banking activities. The Volcker rule, by the way, the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 has been repealed in 1999 during the Clinton administration. No longer needed. With an act, Financial Modernization Act. If you want to be modern, why do you need to keep this story? It's just an impediment. Okay, that's 1 month ago, all right? The Volcker rule has been taken out of this financial regulation which are trying to. Sustainable reproduction. This is our Green New Deal, or at least is the way I can see it. Remember that we always start with people and planet for reproduction. Not labor and lands, really people and planet, and then they become. Then you have the input-output needs, the old input-output structure, so something in the quantities you produce and the price, but we also have to keep in mind in our review of sustainable reproduction, and I will say that during this production activity, social and economic production activity, we also leave a planet which can be better off or worse off. And we can leave people which are either better off or worse off. More educated, because we have decided to invest in education. More poor, with very poor possibilities to find a decent job, SDG number 8, okay? So, people and planet are also outcomes. They are not just inputs, which gives an idea that reproduction is really something which circulates. And our task then is to think in terms, okay, input, output structure, what we invest, what we produce, but also where the people are. This I skip. This is number 17, is the most important of all. Multilateralism, you have that there, Richard. Global Partnership for Sustainable Development. Come on. What else can we? This is the content of number 17. Finance, technology, capacity building, trade. Okay? This is basically means how do we decide how our societies are organized. Who decides what to, how much, and how to produce? It's a very old question. Not any generic value, concrete use values, real things, okay? Who decides? You know, I have the feeling, Richard and Gül, that probably in this Green New Deal or global Green New Deal, the most important word, is deal. Green, everyone has to be green. If you're not. New, you can. I can be old because of my age, but otherwise you have to be new, okay? But the problem is deal, because deal means that shared power in one way or the other. This is the last one. We started with, you know, the founding fathers. We should remember this guy, okay, Montesquieu, 1748, is really the father of enlightenment. And this is what he was writing about, the separation of powers, which is the reason why he is famous for judiciary, political power, executive power, and legislative power. You have to split the powers, to share the powers, in order to avoid that someone abuses of power. I guess that we have to keep this in mind, okay? Our challenge, and your challenges are really that of, okay, we are economists, good economists, young economists, but behind our model, behind our research, there is always an element of who decides and who takes decision about how to invest. What is done here is going to determine the rest and the way we will be living and our children will be living in the future. Va bene, sto.
Well, not so much. I want to kind of bookend Cameron's comments, which will focus very much on the history of Unctad. I want to follow on from him with more of a discussion of what the global Green New Deal is and what we're trying to push through that narrative. I just want to start with a bit even more ancient history than Cameron is going to do, and picking up in a way something that Gianni said at the end of his remarks about not going back to Bretton Woods, which I agree with and don't agree with in a way, I think. But just to remind you of the broader history of multilateralism, right? I mean, we didn't give you a reading. Did we give a reading list?
We have.
I mean, there's a number of books there's a number of books that are worth reading on the history of multilateralism. I mean, it's a vast topic. Well, the ones that at least I like, I mean, besides Slobodian's The Globalists, which I think is a must-read for young students interested in this history, I think. And it has a very important contemporary resonance, the Slobodian's book. There's a great book by Mark Mazower called Global Governance, The History of an Idea, which is also an important book on this topic. And there's a great book by Eric Helleiner called The Forgotten Origins of Bretton Woods, which I think which is important because a lot of people remember Bretton Woods for the debates between Harry Dexter White, representing the US as the global creditor, and John Maynard Keynes as representing the declining hegemon and the problems of an indebted country, which was the United Kingdom at the end of the Second World War. But there were a lot of developing countries present in Bretton Woods. There were 700 delegates in Bretton Woods, and quite a large number of them were from the developing world. And there's a debate that was going on that came out, particularly of discussions in Latin America, with following Roosevelt's good neighbor policy to the south, which resonated in Bretton Woods. It didn't go in the direction that many people wanted, but it's an important and forgotten discussion. Eric Helleiner's book goes through that discussion, and it's an excellent It's an excellent history. Just to remind you, the interwar period, because all of this comes out of the interwar period. I mean, you can divide it crudely. The 1920s, coming out at the end of the First World War, was an attempt to get back to what was considered the good First World War I system. Gold standard, independent central banks, flexible labour markets. Not possible. Politics had changed fundamentally as a consequence of World War I. But that was the need to get back to what the return to normalcy, as it was called, was the big political agenda of the 1920s. The problem was that the UK, which had underpinned the pre-war system, was not in an economic position to do so. And the United States, which was the emerging hegemon, was not really interested in doing so. And the problem, particularly around issues of indebtedness in the 1920s, was a problem of coordination between these emerging and submerging economic. The lack of coordination was and the desperate attempts to find a system that could coordinate beyond the gold standard was dominated discussions in the 1920s, failed. The 1930s comes along, and the response to the crisis in the 1930s was austerity, slashing public spending, trying to put the burden of the financial imbalances onto workers and labour, and the consequences of which was a deflationary spiral in several countries, resort to protectionism as the only possible response. Fiscal policy was out of the question because it was simply outside the mindset of policymakers and politicians at that time, and we know the consequences. Bad economics breeds bad politics, and in the context of the 1930s, bad politics was very, very bad, with the rise of fascism across much of Western Europe, and the consequences of that we know. So when it comes to the good side of that, of course, was that you got the beginnings of ideas that broke with that thinking in the 1930s, the rise of the New Deal, in the United States under Roosevelt, being the most dramatic attempt to break with that kind of political economy paradigm that had led to fascism and ultimately to war. So you had these roots, and these roots of the challenges of coordination, the dangers of austerity, and the search for an alternative were what fed into the Bretton Woods discussions in the 1940s, and in an interdependent world, what kind of multilateralism could we forge that would actually support governments at home to avoid the problems of deflation, mass unemployment, and political corruption of one kind or another. So that was the origins of Bretton. Now, and you read and this was really hardwired into the thinking of the many of the delegates in Bretton Woods. And if you read Ed Conway's book on the summit, you get that sense. Of course, Bretton Woods was, it was imperfect from the beginning for political reasons. There was a pushback very quickly from organized finance and business that had lost its legitimacy in the 1930s as a consequence of the Depression. I mean, the big business, big finance became an illegitimate force in the 1930s. And so the room to create multilateralism was very much born out of that political economy, the rise of organized labor, etc. But there was even though Bretton Woods was a fundamental break, there was very quickly a pushback against the way in which multilateralism, under the inspiration of the New Deal, was heading. And you saw that very, very quickly, really, the need for an international trade organization. So we had Bretton Woods in 44, we had the Havana Conference in 47, 48, which was an attempt to set up an international trade organization that would complement Bretton Woods, with a much more expansionary kind of policies, with a real commitment to development and industrialization in the South, with the need to manage commodity markets was hardwired into the ITO agenda, the need to deal with large international corporations with excessive asymmetric power. That was all part of the ITO agenda. Of course, very quickly there was a pushback in the United States. Slobodian's book, interestingly, has a discussion of this in which institutions like the International Chamber of Commerce and others pushed back very heavily. It was the first real pushback against the new post-war consensus was in the area of international trade. And the International Trade Organization died because the American Congress would not pass it in 1949. 1950, the Red Scare was already emerging as part of the American discourse at that time. So you move from an international trade organization to what was GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which was a much less ambitious trade agenda than the ITO. It was just about cutting tariffs, basically. That's all it was about. You had the Marshall Plan in 1947, of course, which was which was the most successful aid program in history. Huge commitment by the United States to rebuild Europe on a scale that we have not seen since. And was very successful. But with effort, there was a desire to, of course, make the Marshall Plan a more general approach to development cooperation. That was killed in the Cold War, essentially, and we shifted to a world of bilateral aid, foreign direct investment as an alternative to the kind of organized planning and financing that was integral to the Marshall Plan on a huge scale. And in the context of Bretton Woods, where at least the World Bank was intended to be a source of long-term, reliable, cheap financing for development, that never really kind of materialized in any significant way. There was an attempt to create a special United Nations Fund for Economic Development in the 1950s that would do that job that the World Bank was meant to do but wasn't doing. And that was also killed in the late 1950s because of lack of commitment by the advanced economies to that kind of serious multilateral long-term financing agenda. So many of the elements that were talked about in the mid-1940s by the late 1950s had already been diluted or disappeared altogether from the multilateral agenda. And that's when developing, Janet mentioned the rise of independent governments in the South begins to influence the international political agenda. And that is, I think, where Unctad begins to germinate. And Cameron is going to take it on from there.
Thank you. I will try to place my presentation on the political economy of change in international economic relations in the context of the institution of Unctad. But before that, I'll take off from where Richard just made his presentation about how the role of the United Nations was foreseen in the context of the global economy and development. At Dumbarton Oaks, when plans were being made for the establishment of the United Nations, the economic role of the United Nations was vested in the Economic and Social Council. And it was supposed to initiate studies, work with governments with a view to a full and effective use of world's economic resources. At San Francisco, where the UN Charter was adopted, the concept was expanded to include higher standards of living, full employment, and conditions of economic and social progress and development. Now, ECOSOC, at its first session in 1946, called for a convening of an international conference on trade and employment, which Richard just referred to. It was held in Cuba in 1948, and it adopted the Havana Charter, and as just Richard has mentioned, it never really came into effect because the U.S. Congress did not ratify that. Now, Raoul Prebisch, I must say that out of those discussions, instead, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was an offshoot of the ITO, was established with 23 advanced countries as a provisional agreement for trading goods among them, and this provisional agreement went on for about 50 years before the establishment of the WTO. Now, just going back a bit in history, I should like to say that Raoul Prebisch, who had become the head of ECLAC in 1950, ECLAC is the Economic Commission for Latin America. He observed that the terms of trade between commodity producers, which were concentrated in the south, and the producers of manufacturers, which were basically in the north, was skewed in favor of the manufacturers. It was enabling them to have greater capital formation and greater capital accumulation in the north. And he encapsulated this concept in what he called the center-periphery theory, where the center was the north and the periphery the south. And this was also referred to as the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, because the UN economist Hans Singer had come up with the same kind of an idea around the same time. Moreover, Prebisch emphasized that the internal and external disequilibria associated with productive structures created a dependency relationship between the South and the North. This eclectic and non-orthodox approach to economics became to be known as structuralism. In order to redress this, the developing countries, according to him, needed to diversify their economies, including by import substitution, stabilize the prices of their commodities, and move up the ladder by acquiring a greater share of world production in manufactures. The latter, he argued, required greater access to world markets through non-reciprocal preferences. In the midst of the Cold War, upon an initiative taken notably by the leaders of India, China, Yugoslavia, and Indonesia in 1955, a group of 29 Asian and African countries and a number of liberation movements came together in a conference organized in Bandung, in Indonesia. The conference's aim was to promote Afro-Asian economic and cultural cooperation and to reject colonialism and neocolonialism by any nation. The participants placed emphasis on the UN Charter as well as on national sovereignty and declared that they were neither beholden to the United States nor to the Soviet Union. This was seen as a political turning point in the struggle for independence and decolonization. Between 1955 and 1960, developing countries' membership in the United Nations grew from 60 to 90 countries, an issue that has already been referred to. In 1961, a summit was held in Belgrade at the initiative of the heads of state of Yugoslavia, India, Egypt, Ghana, and Indonesia. The summit was attended by 25 heads of state, and they took up the principles that were enunciated in Bandung, and they created the non-aligned movement, the first grouping of developing countries from different countries willing to put forward a united political front. With an increasing number of African countries achieving independence in the 1960s and joining the UN, the emergence of the South as a political force had started to take shape. The multilateral financial institutions and the GATT were basically dominated by the North. The UN was the only forum for international action to address the economic challenges and the concerns of the South. But this was initially confined to regional challenges. The reluctant acceptance of the North for an expanded economic role for the United Nations was that the poverty in the South could pave the way for increasing influence by the Soviet Union. As you know, the Soviet Union had started to create heavy industry and infrastructure in the South and providing support for national liberation movements. And this was seen by the US as a major challenge that they had to overcome. Hence, the launching of the UN Development Decade in 1961, which was an initiative of the Kennedy administration. Developing countries, 36 of them, met in Cairo in 1962 and called for an international conference under the auspices of the UN where the issues of trade, commodities, finance, and development could be discussed. At the UN General Assembly, agreement was reached to call for convening of a United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, inter alia, with the aim of providing greater market access to developing countries and stabilizing commodity prices. At the request of the GA, Raoul Prebisch was requested to prepare a report entitled Towards a New Trade Policy for Development, which would form the basis for negotiations of the conference. He took extensive trips all around the world to consult governments on the preparation of this report. In the preparatory phase of the discussions for the creation of Unctad, at the initiative of Yugoslavia, a group of developing countries, 77 developing countries, got together to draw up common positions. And at the first conference held in 1964 in Geneva, they presented draft resolutions based on Prebisch's report. And this was the beginning of a real solidarity among developing countries in presenting common positions on the issues, major issues of development that they needed to address in the context of multilateral negotiations. The institution of this, an international mechanism with a mandate to negotiate a wide range of their trade and development problems, was seen as a major achievement by the developing countries. Hence the establishment of Unctad. It was established in 1964 by GA Resolution 1995-19 as a permanent organ of the General Assembly with its headquarters in Geneva, with the objective of promoting trade, including among countries with different economic and social systems, with a view to accelerating economic growth and development of developing countries. The conference did recognize the contribution and limitations of existing international institutions and arrangements dealing with trade and related problems of development. And between the sessions of the conference, there was a Trade and Development Board established with several subcommittees or commissions to deal with the issues which were at hand. And for the purposes of elections to the board, lists were drawn up of member states. List A and C consisted of Asian and African and Latin American countries and the Caribbean, of course. And list B included members of the developed market economies, and list D consisted of countries of the Eastern Bloc. The G77 was drawn up from list A and C. And some years later, many years later, China joined the group of 77. The mandate of the organization cut across a number of development-related issues. These included notably trade and access to markets, the commodity problematic, shipping and insurance, technology, financing related to trade and development, and other issues such as access to markets. From the very beginning, there was an underlying tension between GATT and Unctad, as the North preferred to maintain Unctad as the sole organization dealing with trade negotiations. In fact, the addition of Part 4 on trade and development to GATT's articles in 1965, right after the establishment of Unctad, was an attempt to demonstrate that GATT also incorporated the development concerns of the South. However, Prebisch, supported by the developing countries, argued that Unctad was mandated to be the center of coordination of all trade and development activities at the UN. GATT was considered a rich man's club, and the socialist countries of Eastern Europe never joined the organization, and therefore it suffered from a deficit of universality. In 1968, as a gesture of goodwill, Prebisch agreed that Unctad and GATT would jointly manage the International Trade Center, which was set up to assist export industries of developing countries. This led to détente over mandates, but neither organization ceded its negotiating role. Prebisch was an early champion of import substitution industrialization in his earlier studies before joining ECLAC. But he saw the limitations to this policy and concluded that the ultimate goal should be export-oriented industrialization as a means of a broad-based development in the South. Before we raised the issue of diversification, this is something that Prebisch had raised many, many years ago. This, in his view, required preferential access to the markets of the North, and at Unctad II, the generalized system of preferences was negotiated and accepted, and this was in 1968, and it was introduced in the GATT as a derogation of the most favored nation clause and the principle of reciprocity. While it was considered as a major achievement by developing countries, the limitations in coverage, difficulties in compliance, and stringent rules of origin meant that the GSP did not really give all the benefits that or its full potential that the developing countries were expecting. And despite the title of the system, what the title of the system may suggest, each preference-giving country was free to select products for which it provided preferences. So it was not really a generalized system. It was a selective system. But the North continued to protect its industries which it considered as sensitive, including textiles and clothing, which the developing countries produce half of it worldwide. And through the multi-fiber arrangement, which went against and contradicted the spirit and the letter of GATT, the South had to accept voluntary export restraints. So the North was continuing to protect their industries where the developing countries were indeed competitive. And the major area of work of UNCTAD's Trade and Development Board was the issue of protectionism and structural adjustment in the North, including tariff and non-tariff barriers of the North, which impeded the development of the manufactured products of the South. Agriculture was also a major bone of contention because of the huge subsidies provided by the European Economic Community, now the EU, and the US, which impeded the development of agricultural exports by the South. Asymmetries in the way goods could be delivered was another area of concern. Negotiations in UNCTAD under the auspice of UNCTAD resulted in the adoption of the 1974 Convention on a Code of Conduct on Liner Conferences. But by the time it went into force in 1983, which it included a cargo sharing agreement, which was 40-40-20, 40 by developing countries sharing with 40% by developed countries, and 20% was left open. But by the time it came into effect, liner conferences were already becoming useless because of bulk transport, container shipping, and the share of liner conferences had begun to diminish. So UNCTAD then concentrated on the UN Convention on Multimodal Transport and the UN Convention on the Carriage of Goods by Sea. Much work went into the harmonization and adoption of container standards and assisting developing countries to cope with these new developments because the developing countries didn't have the capacities for container shipping. One of the major issues which Prebisch had raised in the very beginning and which developing countries had also raised in the context of the ITO was the issue of the commodities problematique. The fluctuation in commodity prices was a major issue for developing countries, and the negotiations which were launched on the International Cocoa Agreement in 1972 was the first real success in negotiating a commodity agreement under UNCTAD. And, but one of the reasons why developed countries agreed at Unctad 4 to accept to enter into negotiations on a wide set of commodities was the oil shock of 1973. As you remember, the OPEC countries had managed to have an agreement among themselves in order to limit supply and to raise prices on their petroleum exports. And the developing countries were concerned that the developed countries were concerned that the developing countries would also create similar cartels in their exports of other commodities. So they reluctantly agreed to enter into a wide set of negotiations at UNCTAD 4 to discuss commodity agreements covering 18 major commodities of export interest to developing countries. These negotiations, however, went on well into the 1980s. And the most extensive set of negotiations on commodities were launched under the auspices of UNCTAD. And, however, it coincided with a major downturn in the 1980s, basically a recession, which witnessed a generalized decline in the prices of all commodities. The collapse of the International Tin Agreement in 1985, which was a very well-run agreement, it was quoted on the London Metal Exchange, meant that commodities with economic clauses would not be negotiated anymore. Basically, this gave the death sentence to the issue of commodities, negotiation of commodities. And a common fund, which was supposed to be established in order to buy buffer stocks, was also, which came into force in 1988, I believe, never had its first window, which was the buffer stocking provision. It never came into force because there were no commodity agreements with economic clauses for it to finance. So it was left with a very small second window, which was for research and development and technical assistance. But another area which was under UNCTAD's work was the issue of development finance, which was a major bone of contention with the North. But it was tolerated to the extent that the ultimate decision-making would rest with the Bretton Woods institutions. But the financing constraint on development linked to the balance of payments pressures was central to UNCTAD's mandate. Early on, UNCTAD placed emphasis on the need for raising global liquidity, and it led to the adoption by the IMF in 1977 of the special drawing rights based on a basket of currencies under the IMF. In the late 70s, the issue of developing country debt was high on the agenda of UNCTAD. In 1978, an agreement was reached in UNCTAD for a retroactive adjustment of the official debt, whereby $6 billion of developing country debt was written off. Furthermore, the compensatory financing facility of the IMF was designed to finance commodity-related shortfalls in response to UNCTAD's push for stabilizing commodity prices. In Manila, UNCTAD 5 called for a comprehensive new program of action for the least developed countries, an issue that has been on the UNCTAD agenda decades later, and it has led to the adoption of preferential treatment to the least developed countries and to other countries such as island developing countries. And it also called for a convening of a UN conference on restrictive business practices, which led to the set of multilaterally agreed principles and rules on RBPs. which was first flagged in the context of the Havana Charter. The Sixth Quadrennial Conference held in Belgrade adopted a statement which underlined that the world economy was caught in a spiral of declining production, employment, and trade. And perhaps the most interesting feature of the conference was the recognition of growing interdependence, not only among countries, but also between issues and sectors of the world economy. The concept of interdependence was already being raised by Unctad economists, and it was raised in its first TDR, this flagship publication, in 1981. Thus, the conference provided Unctad with a wide mandate in its research and analysis in taking a comprehensive and global perspective on international economic environment and how it affects development. Now I'll come to the lost decades for development. As I indicated, with the slump in commodity prices and the onset of the recession in the 80s, we were witness to a re-emergence of a debt crisis in most of the developing countries. In particular, the Latin American countries had borrowed heavily from the international capital markets in the second half of the 70s and early 80s, as petrodollars were being recycled on the expectation that the slump in commodity prices was a temporary and cyclical phenomenon. But it turned out to be incorrect. Prices of commodity continued to fall. And with the rise in interest rates in the US, developing countries, and particularly those who had contracted dollar-denominated debt at variable rates, were seriously hit, and particularly the Latin American countries. In the meantime, only a handful of East Asian economies had managed to diversify their economies and raise the level of their manufactures. And with the secular decline in the prices of commodities, African countries also found themselves in a severe balance of payments position and had no recourse but turned to multilateral financial institutions for aid. But, of course, there was no free lunch. The conditions imposed by the multilateral financial institutions consisted of market-oriented reforms, the dismantling of the commodity boards, which were responsible for determining prices and buying the commodities from the producers to sell on the international market, the reduction of extension services to farmers, and allowing markets to determine prices. As a result, and this went over a couple of decades, the farmers became increasingly atomized, while multinational corporations became increasingly concentrated, thus enabling them to dictate prices of commodities. Developed market economies were themselves taking the initiative for promoting market-oriented reforms. Both Richard and others have referred to the statement by Reagan that government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. Open trade and financial markets, reduction of the role of the state in the economy, prudent macroeconomic policies, privatization, deregulation, and the unleashing of the entrepreneurial spirits were seen as the path to economic salvation. It was premised on the belief that markets adjusted themselves and always shifted to stable equilibrium with large efficiency gains, while state intervention failed. This was raised in the previous discussion. So state planning and state-supported industrialization were thus eliminated from the lexicon of development. IMF surveillance role had mutated into disciplining developing countries, ensuring that they adopt the neoliberal policies through policy conditionality. Similar conditionalities were also being applied by the World Bank in loans provided to the poorest countries in their lending programs, including through IDA, the International Development Association loans. In the 80s and 90s, adjustment programs were applied with unprecedented vigor, but they failed to boost growth, leading to premature deindustrialization and, in many cases, greater poverty in developing countries. All this was a direct challenge to the Keynesian and economic structuralism of the post-war era. The seventh session of Unctad, held in Geneva in 1987, was convened at the period when this policy shift was in full force. No doubt the launching of the Uruguay multilateral trade negotiations in 1986 was starting to cast a shadow over Unctad's relevance in the area of international trade. With the increased number of developing countries becoming members of GATT or participating in the round, with the possibility of future membership in whatever was to come out of it, the developed countries were able to push Unctad in its final act to just recognize the supporting role that Unctad could have in assisting developing countries in the context of the Uruguay round negotiations. The role was later expanded considerably in advising developing countries in their bid to join the WTO. Until then, the relationship between GATT and Unctad had remained at arm's length. But here, Unctad was turned from a negotiating institution on trade and development-related issues to being a supportive role to developing countries in their negotiations within the context of the GATT. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, followed by the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was interpreted by some Western observers as the victory of capitalism and the neoliberal project. Francis Fukuyama, which I'm sure all of you know, an American political scientist, in an essay in 1989 and later in his book published in 1992, went so far as coining it as the end of history, arguing that it represented the end point of man's ideological evolution and the universalization of free market capitalism and Western liberal democracy. As numerous Eastern European countries either joined the EU or initiated the process to do so, Group D, that is the group consisting of the Eastern European countries, ceased to function in Unctad. As a result, developing countries which had hitherto relied on the support of the former Soviet bloc countries found themselves in a much weaker bargaining position. Moreover, cracks were beginning to appear within the G77. The Latin American countries, which had recently emerged from their debt crisis, had fully embraced a neoliberal reform agenda coined by the American economist John Williamson as the Washington Consensus. Thus, at UNCTAD 8, held at Cartagena in Colombia, they distanced themselves from the rest of the G77. They were convinced that their interests would be better served in the context of a Uruguay round, or possibly through an extended North American free trade agreement. The official dismantling of the Soviet bloc's Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, CMEA, in 1991, and the disarray in the ranks of the G77 was used as an opportunity by the North at chipping away at the negotiating role of UNCTAD. It was agreed that UNCTAD's mandate would follow a sequence which consisted of identifying issues, conducting in-depth analysis, undertaking intergovernmental discussions, and, when deemed appropriate, leading to negotiations. The North was thus able to shift the emphasis on what it considered to be the post-Cold War consensus. Meanwhile, Boutros Ghali, who had become the UN Secretary General in 1992, followed the advanced countries in viewing the comparative advantage of the UN in peace, security, human rights, and social issues. According to this approach, hard economic issues were the domain of the Bretton Woods institutions, which had the resources to back up the policies they preferred. In a restructuring of the UN Secretariat in New York, the work of the UN Center on Transnational Corporations was shifted to UNCTAD. The center's work had been transformed from devising a code of conduct on TNCs to promote foreign direct investment, particularly through the World Investment Report. Foreign direct investment was touted as a means to fill the financing gap of developing countries with additional benefits such as the transfer of technology, job creation, and increase in export capacity. UNCTAD's Trade and Development Report, however, had a more nuanced approach, calling for a cost-benefit analysis of FDI, as well as greater oversight by host countries. Despite the fact that this move weakened the policy coherence within the UNCTAD Secretariat, it was seen by its management as a useful balancing act to satisfy both Group B and the developing countries. With the establishment of the WTO in 1995, doubts were already being used about the usefulness of maintaining UNCTAD as an organization, as the membership of the WTO had expanded considerably to include a large number of developing countries, making it a quasi-universal body. The new body's mandate was expanded beyond tariff negotiations to areas such as agriculture, trade-related intellectual property rights, services, including financial services, trade-related investment measures, trade facilitation, and a host of other issues, many of which were hitherto within the purview of UNCTAD. Group B, using this as their main argument at UNCTAD 9, held in South Africa in 1996, ended any notion of maintaining a negotiating role for UNCTAD and shifted its work program to helping developing countries integrate into a globalizing world and successfully push for downsizing of the organization. Despite the triumph of the neoliberal policies, however, the mid-90s were witness to another bout of major debt crisis, including the second Mexican debt crisis in 1994, by the way, which was discussed in TDR 1993, as had foreseen it. And this was followed by the East Asian African financial crisis of 1997. UNCTAD had on many occasions foreseen and warned of the dangers of short-term capital flows and the devastating effects they could engender if market sentiments changed. The fall of the Thai currency sent investors running, and the contagion effect spread to most East Asian countries and other emerging economies. Rather than introducing capital controls, the policy advised by the multilateral financial institutions was to raise interest rates on national currencies to stem the outflow, which proved to be totally ineffective. Private debt owed to international capital markets were transformed into public debt, public liabilities. Belt tightening and contraction in government spending were introduced. The region suffered tremendous setback, engendering low growth and widespread poverty. And the only country in the region which was spared from the full impact of the crisis was Malaysia. Why? Because in spite of policy advice, they successfully introduced capital controls. UNCTAD 10 was held at the turn of the century right after this crisis. The mood was clearly changed as the Washington consensus has been put to a serious test, and some analysts had declared it as dead. The Seattle meeting of the WTO, held the previous year, had ended acrimoniously with no results. Globalization had been clearly felt that even the successful emerging economies had been subjected to major economic and financial shocks. And the conference recognized that globalization also carried risks, such as income disparities between and within countries, increasing poverty, intensification of asymmetries and imbalances in the world economy, and instability in international financial systems. The soul-searching at UNCTAD 10 was, however, short-lived. And while there was clearly an opportunity to revive UNCTAD as an institution to deal with the fundamental issues of development, the attention of the international community was turned away from development issues to deprivation, in particular to extreme poverty. This led to the adoption of the Millennium Development Goals by the UN at the end of 2000. While these goals, which were only partly met, and largely thanks to rapid growth in China, was laudable. However, the MDGs did not address the root causes of poverty and were, basically a palliative to soften the continued adherence to the neoliberal globalization agenda. In this connection, I would like to quote Raoul Prebisch. He had made a contribution to the UNCTAD Trade and Development Review in 1979, which had a decidedly contemporary ring some 20 years later. He says, another idea has now appeared which fires the enthusiasm of some northern economies, that of eradicating poverty, a phenomenon apparently they have just discovered. Who could refuse to fight against poverty? But is this possible outside the context of development and an enlightened international policy? In a bid to appear more business-friendly, the UN had already, late in the 1990s, introduced a global compact through which multinational corporations would agree to exercise global social responsibility on a voluntary basis in return for the UN seal of approval. Thus, efforts at creating multilateral oversight over the activities of the TNCs were appended in favor of acts of goodwill by the latter, despite the well-known fact that the corporations are only beholden to their shareholders. As a result, the involvement of the corporate sector in the work of the UN, and particularly that of UNCTAD, became increasingly visible. At the same time, there was a growing frustration with the negative results from over 2 decades of applying neoliberal agenda. The idea that growth-enhancing trade and industrial development policies needed to be adapted to the individual requirements of countries began to make a comeback. Such adaptation, UNCTAD argued, and it's been referred to, was the notion accepted at UNCTAD 11, which was that there was the need for governments to evaluate the trade-off between the benefits of accepting international rules and commitments and the constraints posed by policy space, loss of policy space. It was also recognized that the role of the state was vital for designing development strategies, attaining equitable income distribution, building human and physical infrastructure, addressing market failures where they occur, and providing enabling macroeconomic conditions and sound regulatory framework. Nevertheless, UNCTAD conferences have ceased to be the international policy organ par excellence, which had as its objectives bringing negotiated changes to the policies, systems, and structures that oversee international economic relations in favor of development. Alas, the quadrennial conferences have become largely reduced to adopting a work program of the institution. I just conclude by a couple of remarks. Owing to the evolution of the international economic relations, as I've described earlier, UNCTAD's ability to shape the international development agenda has diminished over time. This has been compounded by allowing the increasing capture of its agenda, as in much of the UN, by the way, by the corporate sector, thus blurring the distinction between global public goods with that of the interests of multinational corporations. Nonetheless, the UNCTAD Secretariat has managed to maintain the capacity to undertake in-depth and cutting-edge policy research and analysis of economic forces bearing on international economic relations and development, particularly in its annual Trade and Development Report. I'm sending you some flowers. Under a committed and visionary leadership of the caliber of its original founders, added to its heterodox perspective, Unctad, I believe, could be well placed to make an important contribution to efforts at building a renewed and reinvigorated multilateral system that addresses the manifold global development challenges ahead. And this requires, above all, a solidarity between the developing countries to push this forward. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kamran, for an extensive, self-critical, honest history of Unctad and its mandate. Please.
Yeah, I would just like, if you're interested in the history of Unctad, John Toy has written an excellent history, which you will find in the back of the room, Unctad at 50. You should certainly, if you're interested in Unctad and its history, take that and read it carefully. Thank you.
The presentation. So you want to say something?
Okay, let me pick up a little bit from Cameron's comprehensive presentation. I think that the point about Unctad and the point about his presentation, Unctad began and was established as an institution whose aim was to reform the system that was inherited from Bretton Woods. It was a globalization at the end of the Second World War for the next 30 years was partial globalization. It was partial in both senses of the word. It was partial in the sense that it was biased towards advanced economies, and it was partial in the sense that it didn't cover a lot of issues that should have been part of the multilateral system, commodities being one, debt being another, that were of direct interest to developing countries. So it was a very partial system. But Unctad was there to change the rules of the game in a development-friendly way. That much of what Cameron just talked about was orchestrated under the rubric of a new international economic order. That was the framework that was kicked off at in the UN in the early 1970s. Unctad essentially was the secretariat for the new international economic order. We weren't called that, but we were de facto the secretariat for the new international economic. So it was a reformist agenda. It was a positive agenda that wanted to make the global rules of the game more development friendly. That was the first 25, even into the 1980s, in response to the debt crisis. Unctad was arguing for a rules-based system to deal with sovereign debt problems in an orderly, timely, efficient fashion, which we are still arguing for. And in the next 5 years, developing countries will realize they should have fought harder for in the 1980s, because you're all going to get hit by significant debt problems over the next 5 to 10 years. That's without a shadow of a doubt. I'll come to that in a second. So that was our agenda. From the 1990s, as the neoliberal agenda took over, we moved from having a positive agenda to essentially being critics of this evolving new system, than what we would call the hyperglobalization system of a dominant financial sector, neoliberalism, rising corporate power. And it's interesting, you're going to get with the 75th anniversary, and you hear it all the time on TV, you switch on Fareed Zakaria on CNN and these other hapless talking heads that we have to listen to on cable news. And they will tell you that we have to defend the 75-year-old liberal open economic order. That's the Trump, they're into scaremongering, right, these people. Trump, Brexit, all these are people who are now damaging the 75-year-old liberal. And that order died in 1979, 1980. This is a myth that this kind of centrist establishment is trying to propagate, that somehow the globalization that we've seen, the hyperglobalization that we've seen post-1979, post-9, is a continuation of the globalization that was created. And is simply not true. The dynamics, as we tried to explain, behind hyperglobalization are of a completely different nature than the kind of taming of capitalism, which was the objective of, Keynes was intent on saving capitalism from itself. That was his objective. And it's a very different order than the kind of order that was released post-1979 around the ideas of hyperglobalization. I mean, I don't want to go through the numbers. So we've become critics, essentially, of what Unctad, from having tried to, offer positive ways of rebalancing the global economy in the 1960s and the 1970s, we've become critics of this new international order. Why is this not working? This is not.
It's going backwards. Well.
I don't know. It's not the. Is it going backwards? Oh yeah, it's going backwards.
Because you're hitting back button.
Okay, this is modern technology. I'm not very equipped to dealing with it. Just broad trends, right? So hyperglobalization, the world that emerges post-1979, is not the same as the Bretton Woods managed globalization. Now, as Jani said, lots of problems with Bretton Woods. Lots of problems. Polarization remained a problem. Lack of technology transfer from north to south remained a problem. Racism, discrimination remained a problem. Militarism, massive expenditures, surrogate wars between the Soviet Union. All these were problems. The dominance of the dollar we know there were problems with Bretton Woods. But there was a serious attempt by the developing world to try and address those problems constructively with sensible changes to the rules on commodities, on debt, on shipping, etc., that Cameron talked about. So debt crisis becomes the pivot around the change happens. The debt crisis of the early 1970s, orchestrated by the Federal Reserve. Paul Volcker jacks up US interest rates to 22% in an attempt to rebalance the US economy in a way that favored US finance and Wall Street. That was what the Volcker paradigm shift was all about. And a successful policy by Volcker, which then becomes not only part of an American agenda, but part of a global agenda, as the US dominance shifts from its initial dominance based upon trade and running surpluses to Wall Street and finance and mobile capital and deep financial markets, of which the US economy remains the pivot. And the consequences of that are in a sense, it's been a success, right? What has it done? It's reduced the power of organized labor. And it's reduced the ability of governments to deliver social services. And you can see that on this graph here, which is the declining share of wages in global income and the declining share of government spending in global income. These are weighted average. You can look at these in the TDR. These are weighted averages. But the decline in the position of labor, the decline of governments to deliver public goods are hardwired into this agenda, and it's been successful in most countries. Not all. There are exceptions. It's been successful in hardwiring and locking in those agendas into free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. The rules of the game that were established in Bretton Woods were broken with the adoption of free trade agreements and bilateral investment treaties. Carlo, you should I'm going to make a quote here. My good friend from the Vatican might not want to hear this. You will remember that Voltaire famously said that the Holy Roman Empire was not holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. It's the same with free trade agreements. Free trade agreements are not about they're not about freedom. They're about tying the hands of governments, particularly developing country governments. They're about reducing policy space. They're not about trade. They're about capital movements. They're about intellectual property. They're about rules and regulations behind the border. They're not about trade. And they're not about agreements. They're about twisting the arms of many developing countries and using whatever geopolitical power you have to make sure that countries sign up to these. So they're not free trade agreements. They're the opposite of that. Nor has the rise of finance, financialization, these are figures in orange on the rise of finance, have been good for investment. The blue line is investment. The orange line is the extent of total external assets and liabilities of developed and developing countries. Those have gone through the roof. You can use different measures of financialization here, but these are figures that have gone through the roof over the last 20 years. What was the promise of financialization? Well, the more space you give to intelligent, innovative financial institutions who know how to use all the efficient market hypotheses, know how to use all the information available to them, the more good investment you will get as a consequence of finance being able to lead those decisions. Not true in terms of the evidence. As you can see from the blue lines, capital formation in the era of hyperglobalization has stalled or declined. So the big promise of this era, that this would be good for investment, entrepreneurs, unleashing entrepreneurship, getting big firms to reinvest in your economy, no, doesn't happen under these rules of the game. What happens? Well, the opposite. This is our favorite graph here. We call it the crocodile graph. The blue line, the green line at the bottom is what you saw before, the declining share of wages in global income. So one of the consequences of the hyperglobalized world is these declines in the wage share. What's the opposite of that? The orange line, which almost mirrors this identically, is the rising share of large international corporations in global income. So as the wage share of working people has gone down, the share of large international corporations has essentially gone up almost in parallel. And what do these companies do with their money? This is what they do with their money. They tell you that they don't make their money in the big markets, right? They're not apparently making money in China or Japan or Germany, which is where most of these operations of these companies take place. Apparently, they're making their money in Bermuda and Luxembourg, which is where they are docking most of the profits that they are making at the expense of developing countries and working people, which is what we know, right? This is the tax haven story. Shaxson will give you this story in much greater detail when he makes his presentation. So these are the rules of the game that we are spending a lot of time in Unctad trying to criticize because they're bad for developing countries, they're bad for the planet, and they're bad for most working communities in both developed and developing countries. And we see this in the volatility of, we know what's behind this, the volatility of capital flows that Cameron talked about, the massive increase in indebtedness. This is the figure for the rise in private and public debt since the emergence of neoliberalism in the late 1970s. I mean, it's an astounding increase in the growth is now debt dependent in many of your countries and certainly in many countries in the advanced world. The countries can no longer grow through what we would think of as normal capital formation, the normal rules of a healthy economy. They have to accumulate these massive volumes of debt, and it doesn't produce very rapid growth. Why doesn't it produce very rapid growth? Lots of the money is hidden in tax havens, and lots of the money goes into stock markets and asset appreciation, the financial mercantilism that Jenny talked about earlier this morning. Big consequence of that, something you all know, massive rising in inequality. One of the dominant features of our hyperglobalized world, and that's true in developed and developing countries, has been the huge increase in inequality, however you measure inequality. There's debates about measurement that you can find that are not unimportant, but the trend of rising inequality, along with rising indebtedness, along with insufficient investment, along with growing instability, has been a feature of this world. And on top of that, and so this is the problem now that we face, and our criticisms I think, have been well positioned. On top of these products of a hyperglobalized world, we now face the problem of environmental breakdown and a heating planet, which clearly predates the rise of neoliberalism, but because neoliberalism is an extractive economic model, which is essentially what it is, it doesn't provide the policies, the values, and the reforms that are required to address these problems. A massive increase in environmental problems, not just rising global temperatures, but degradation of land, decimation of oceans, the rise of the problems with plastic, the whole slew of issues that you, I'm sure, all know about as part of the environmental breakdown that is now challenging. So the question then for us is, how do you deal with a social breakdown in many communities as public services get obliterated? How do you deal with economic breakdown as there's been a massive shift of income from capital to labour? And how do you deal with environmental breakdown as the planet heats up and a whole slew of related environmental problems get exposed? And that essentially is where we think moving from a critique of this system of hyperglobalization to a positive agenda can be built around the notion of a global Green New Deal. So let me just finish quickly with this. And these are the nice things that we all want, right? I mean, I'm not a fan of the SDGs, not because it's a good thing, but it's people just lose. When you talk about 17 goals and 179 targets and 400, people have lost you already. It's just too complicated, and it's a list. It's just, which is what it is. It's a list of nice stuff that we all want, the SDGs, and it's a much better list than the MDGs, that's for sure. But it's just a list, right? It doesn't provide a framework in which you can design policies and reforms that can actually deliver on those. We've tried to synthesize that into a simpler set of problems: full and decent employment, just society, caring community, participatory politics, sustainable future. That's what we think are the basic. It's a bit like what Gianni did in terms of his synthesis of the SDG 17 goals. I mean, and this is where maybe I disagree. We want to hark back to the old New Deal. This was a genuine attempt to make for a better capitalism, and it wanted to do it by ensuring that there was relief for people unemployed, there was recovery of the economy from unemployment, there was regulation, particularly of finance, but also of labour markets, and there was redistribution of income from those at the top in a more fair and just fashion. So relief, recovery, regulation and redistribution are the 4 R's of the old New Deal, and they should be the 4 R's of the Green New Deal. And in a sense, that's what Ocasio-Cortez and these other people are actually trying to present when they talk about the need to end austerity, the need for public investment, the need for industrial policy of a green nature, the need to link wages better to productivity, the need to regulate private capital flows to deal with the problems of predatory finance. That's what she's offering, right? That's clearly a repetition of the old New Deal for the 21st century. The problem with that is that you can't, in an interdependent, hyper-globalized world, countries cannot solve these problems by putting their own house in order, because so many of these problems have an international or multilateral dimension that you need to solve them collectively. You can't solve the climate problem one country at a time. Doesn't work. Because by the time we've got to China, the world is at 4 degrees, 3.5 degrees above industrial revolution temperatures. So that doesn't work. So we need this multilateralism, and we need it at a time when multilateralism is being trashed. Beginning with a rogue hegemon, but you can't blame you can't blame Trump. This is not Trump that's the problem here. These are problems with the slow degradation of multilateralism over the last 30 years under a system that says you don't need governments to set rules for countries. All you need is to allow private capital to move around the world, and they will solve these problems for you. That's the nature of hyperglobalization. So we want a different narrative from that, and that's the narrative of the narrative of the Global Green New Deal that I'm doing with Kevin Gallagher at Boston U, my good friend Kevin, who's at the back now, about the need to try and think about the kinds of structures that you need at the international level to support the kind of national policies that we're hearing about at the national level under the Green New Deal in the United States, Europe, and I think of relevance to many developing countries too. And we will, I hope, pad out this argument during the course of the week. But some of the elements, we have 5 elements that you can see here, I won't go into them, that we think can allow a more progressive view of the multilateral system that offers a positive way forward, deals with what are these tremendous problems on the economic, environmental and social front, and genuinely provides the narrative that is needed if we're going to meet the 2030 agenda in the time allotted. And we've got a decade left, essentially. We're talking about a decade to meet the 2030 agenda. We are nowhere near meeting that agenda in 2019. And so this is an attempt to provide the framework, the narrative that allows countries to rethink both their national policies and their global agenda. So that's what we're trying to do with people in Boston University, with colleagues in other parts of the world. Thank you.